response.
I have to go.
Any questions to
Can we take one little question last? Well, I really want to thank you for bringing so much new information, particularly on how we are going to be impacted in South Asia and Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about how, in terms of the differentially, it is going to impact, say in terms of gender? I mean, farmers are not one single block. They are men and women, and we know that 80% of the world's farmers are women. So, what are your thoughts on how women farmers particularly, because still more than 30% of the farming households are female-headed, so that's another dimension we need to look at. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are...
Sumanji, if you don't mind, if I have the permission of the chair, I was just going to add to her, to the gender dimension, if you don't mind, if you want to take the comments and answer the women's issue in one this thing. I agree. I do want to thank both the presenters. I think it was a very in-depth coverage. But yes, I think it is very important to recognize a couple of things from women's perspective. One is the impact of climate change on women, and second is what role women play in climate justice. And in particularly talking about agriculture and food security, women are key food producers and hence have a very important role in food security in India also, and globally, and in India particularly. Women play a very important role. Now, you look at food production. Today, because of crisis in agriculture, the face of a farmer in India is not necessarily a man. A lot of women are in agriculture, especially in the small agriculture, and a large-scale farm worker, and so women's livelihoods are very closely connected to food production, agriculture in a large way. Now, seed conservation is a very important women's role in our region, and this role not only is an important role women do, but doing that also provides women a status in family and in communities. And so by jeopardizing seeds, definitely have an impact on women's livelihood and also on the larger status of women in food production. In other, so looking at, like, even from a gender perspective, women are more involved in climate dependent forms of livelihood than the larger. Okay, so you want me to stop? Because I feel there's a very important need to talk about gender, and I felt that was totally missing since morning. So if you want me to stop, I will, but I think there is a real need to bring in women's issues in this conversation.
I'm saying only Manju is leaving, will be leaving.
No, I think this should continue. I've already talked to you in the coffee break, so you know what my answer to that is.
Right.
And if the youth in the yellow shirt can get off Gurinda's face, maybe I can address her.
Yeah. Sir.
That's right. See, the thing about agriculture and women, we know that there's a feminization of agriculture because of the enormous pressure and men having to migrate for jobs. This has been happening for a while, and yet we have no response to that. If you start looking at, you don't have women adequate technologies. The thresholds are still that high, and your average Indian woman is standing here, which can't reach the threshold. So there is a lack of response, and there's also a lack of response in the question of how women are going to be impacted. Whatever the impact is, I think if you add a 30% negative on that, that's how badly women are going to be impacted. Because there is in any case no preparation to equip them for agriculture under the best of circumstances, let alone under climate change. But I want to raise one question here which I raised with you already. What are the women's groups doing? This work should be done by the women's groups. Because if you're just going to sit there and talk about whether RU64 is a good agent or not, and whether people should not be thrashing their wives at home, those are very noble things to fight for. But unless women's groups themselves don't get out and talk about the larger issues that affect women's livelihoods, then the spearheading of that, I think, I would lay that responsibility in the first instance. And they should network, I mean, which is not to say that this work should not be done by 35 other agencies. But, you know, if I'm interested in a particular sector, shouldn't I be getting up and getting on with it? And getting you on board and you on board and 25 other people on board and saying, you know, I'm really concerned about what's happening to women farmers. I'm really concerned about what's happening to women's livelihoods. Can we put together and start looking at this, and can we do some studies, can we do some investigations? So in the same way that I was being critical of civil society and not pushing its weight into policy making, I'm also being critical of women's groups in a constructive kind of way, of not bringing in these core issues into the debate. It's not only they who should be fighting, but they should take an initiative and say, okay, fine, let's start getting them. There's no question. The bottom line is women are going to be worse affected than the men, because just on the proportionate impact of everything on them as compared to the men. But I would urge women's groups really to integrate with others a little bit more, to understand these issues and to put stuff out into the policy domain and get a better understanding, then getting into good rights advocacy.
Could I respond to her or?
Please.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Two words.
Rishabh,
Two.
you have anything? We'll continue this discussion,
Sure.
but for the sessions, there's quickly.
Just say one word.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm Rishabh. Thank you for both the presentations. I think it was really important for us to understand more about the agriculture, and we were waiting for a long time for something to come out from India. There are three sort of things came into mind. One was that how the current policy, this current mission is addressing other ecological hazards like topsoil loss or biodiversity loss in the format of farming, in the climate resilient farming, or is it just linked to low carbon farming, which a lot of say groups like the Fair Climate Network are promoting in states like Karnataka. Second is in terms of the microclimatic zones. I'm glad you brought up that point. A lot of the farming community don't perceive agriculture just from a rainfall point of view. They perceive it from this ritus hote hain, different various seasonal imbalances. So how do you address that? And largely from just a plain simple farmer's point of view, how do these people access knowledge on low carbon farming or climate resilient farming? What scale would it happen in? Because we've seen in things like RED Plus and other CDM mechanisms, largely the people who are impacted don't get the benefit of these programs. So can you just tell us more about that?
Yeah, certainly it is mitigation heavy. There's no doubt approach, because it is rightly so in some sense. I'm not talking about the mission as such, whatever the international negotiations, the context in which it is placed, because it needs some immediate action. And also adaptation is seen as the backyard climate change, which one could really manage. That kind of an attitude is there. And our mission is more focused on adaptation. One should acknowledge the fact that it's not really totally mitigation driven, though we have certain obligations as part of the international commitments that we have. To an extent, we are trying to answer those questions which have been raised, particularly in terms of livestock, methane emissions from livestock or whatever is it, because there should be really backed up with good scientific figures and facts. So in that sense, it's been really tuned to that aspect. That is all right. But topsoil, I mean, there are certain mitigation elements to it, but I'm looking from the conservation agriculture perspective, which has been there. It's not today the climate change is there or not, it has been there. These kind of management systems are already in place, which we're very good at it. Unfortunately, it has not been really documented well. There are certain, it depends on the agroclimatic zone where agriculture is in practice, and all this kind of stuff has to be really, that is where the trust is. That links to the point of knowledge, what you've been talking about, knowledge base. And it is high time the capacity is built locally. That is the only way to do adaptation business. To me, that's very, very critical. And there are umpteen number of examples where we really, tried very difficult situations in the past doing this kind of things. But the climate dimension brings a little more complexity to that. People have been going by the stars and moons and stuff. Certainly, these are important to understand the cultural, to ground your own arguments with cultural ethos. But science is also an important element. Where do you really marry these two? That is where the tension is. You know? I'm glad you raised this question. One of the interesting things, when we implemented this small pilot study in one of the villages in Rajasthan where we established these agromet stations, very simple station with a rain gauge and an anemometer and a Stevenson thermometer to understand, to kind of daily forecast these things. Traditionally, this has been done by the BOPAs, what we call as BOPAs. There is an inherent tension. Every day they discuss together. This is where the kind of knowledge really merges, synergy that happens. They challenge each other to see what is the best thing. So this capacity building component is very, very critical in understanding, particularly in climate change context. It is, people have been really, they know what's going on, but they can't really accurately say, this is how the pattern is. So in that sense, that knowledge is very critical, and it has to be tuned. That is one of the missing elements of the whole exercise. Of course, we have agro advisories and those things. It is catching up, but still a long way to go. Unless you empower them at the local level, it's going to be a difficult task. And another thing is the demystification of science. How do you communicate this? That's another critical element. That's the entirely different ball game, and one has to be really geared to that. That's another aspect one has to really focus on. I'm not sure I've answered your questions, but these are very
Sure. Because we will continue these discussions post lunch also, because they have been done by, I think, just last one question we'll take, and then we'll have to break for lunch. We'll come back after lunch and continue this discussions and interactions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Novin. This is regarding the capacity building for adaptations. So the focus, I think, the earlier speaker also was mentioning about. We have two very serious questions. One is, see, in the mountain areas, the whole agriculture is shifting Jhum cultivations. This is going on. Now, if the forest is taken away under the REDD+, the villagers are not going to get this opportunity for this rotating kind of Jhum practices for their food security. Whether this is under in your research or the Government of India's research studies, how the adaptation can be built in that community. The second question is, when we talk about adaptations, we also raise the questions about the funding. The money should come for adaptations. That is a very important part, but however, how this fund is make sure that it reaches to the people who are affected. Does the government, either the state or national government, has the proper effective mechanisms to implement? Very often our fear is that we came from a conflict area, armed conflict areas. If these funds are siphoned to different armed groups by the guns and shooting around, then it will have a negative impact on the issues. And all these discussions of adaptations require this dimension to be looked into very seriously. And third question is, we talk about adaptation, we also need to think whether it is possible to think about mitigations. In the north is reducing emission, or China and India is going to be increased in the thing. Why they don't reduce? What is their policies? And why other small countries or developing countries can also have some privilege for equitable justice in this climate change. Thank you.
Your third question is far larger a question because that's the entire international debate is all about that. So I will leave it to the kind of experts here to talk about it. And I will address the second question, is adaptation finance. Of course, there's nothing at the country level which is being talked about. There are certain managed funds and stuff where you get us projects here and there, but not as a kind, because there is a big vacuum there at the top. The international community is not committed yet at a big level. There's a lot of talks about it. And one thing is about the funding aspect, another how the mechanisms mechanics to handle those funds. That's another thing. That is, we made some headway in Cancun in terms of the adaptation committee, the creation of the adaptation committee to manage these resources, how effective it's going to be, what are the roles and responsibilities and other things. So that has to percolate down to the national level we are not yet there. So of course there are some thought process of maybe Durban might give some kind of impetus to this process. We only hope so. So that is where it stands. And the gun culture and other things, this is one of the very common excuses, particularly not in our context, in the African context, how the development money has been taken away for other purposes and swindle and other things. So that genuine fear, probably there's an element of genuine fear, not with Asia, with Africa, because there's enough examples in the past. So that is also played out as a big an excuse in terms of the commitments of what you see in the international negotiations. So these are very thorny issues, but it has been ironed out, methodically. It will take some time. And I'm no expert in Red Plus and Red and other things, but as you know, India takes the lead in Red negotiations, and of course they have our Jagdish, the Secretary in Forestry, IG Forestry, who is the lead negotiator, and he's a very community-centric person. He's really pushing this agenda very forcefully. We have some made away last year in Cancun, but I'm no expert in that area, so I can't really. Of course, the community elements have been thought about, and it's really it's emerging.
Before we break for lunch, just 2-3 quick points. One is we connected with the purpose of organizing this kind of exchanges. Is Beyond Copenhagen have been trying to raise this issue of agriculture, and not only agriculture as such, but smallholder low input farming, which is called peasant farming, which is very critical, into the international negotiation stage in whatever capacity we have. And right from Copenhagen we have been trying to raise this repeatedly, but I would like to flag this also for further discussions after lunch session, that most of forget about the national governments, most of the international civil society groups are very, very scared, or they have a position that agriculture should not form at all a part of the negotiation. So there is a contradiction, because most of even the civil society discourse as of today is dominated by northern NGOs and northern civil society groups. So there is a very strong dominant perspective that agriculture should not come into negotiation at all, whereas our position was that agriculture, peasant farming must form a part of the negotiation, because that is going to be most impacted, which is उसको ऊपर असर सबसे ज़्यादा पड़ रहा है already. वो एक point है, और ये हम लोग बार-बार उठा रहे हैं कोपेनहेगन में, कैनकुन में, बॉन में, हर जगह में हम लोगों ने और काफ़ी बड़ा स्केल में कोशिश किया जितने लोगों को इन्वॉल्व कर सके. Second, taking it from and giving a cue for the next sessions also, to keep in mind, डरबन में एक बड़ा मुद्दा है, 2 मुद्दा बड़ा है, 3 मुद्दा बड़ा है. एक तो क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल का सेकंड कमिटमेंट पीरियड रहेगा कि नहीं रहेगा, क्या फॉर्म रहेगा, वो एक बड़ा मुद्दा है. क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस एक बड़ा मुद्दा है, उसमें अडेप्टेशन का क्या रोल है, अडेप्टेशन कितनी हिस्सा मिलेगा, वो सब है. लेकिन साथ साथ एक बहुत बड़ा मुद्दा है, इफ एनीबॉडी हैज फॉलोड, पिछले साल FAO ने, फूड एंड एग्रीकल्चर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने एक रिपोर्ट जारी की थी. उसमें बहुत डिटेल रिपोर्ट है, वो पब्लिक डोमेन में है, आप डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं. उसमें दिया हुआ है जो एक थ्रस्ट जो डरबन में माना गया है इस बार क्लाइमेट चेंज कॉन्फ्रेंस में, सॉइल कार्बन सिक्वेस्ट्रेशन थ्रू एग्रीकल्चर इन ट्रॉपिकल कंट्रीज. दिस विल बी ए थ्रस्ट. दैट मीन्स थर्ड वर्ल्ड कंट्रीज, poorer countries farmers now will be targeted to mitigate greenhouse gas emission. और FAO रिपोर्ट बोलते हैं, जो रिलीज किया है और जो उनको रिपोर्ट में है, they expect 75% of agricultural soil carbon mitigation to come from third world tropical countries. So this is a very clear, जो हम बोलते हैं ना खतरे का घंटी है, रेड फ्लैग, वो सामने है. इसका बहुत जबरदस्त पुश है, और एक बार ये एग्रीकल्चर, स्मॉल होल्डर फार्मिंग और एग्रीकल्चर पूरा मार्केट मैकेनिज्म में आ जाए, CDM का अंदर आ जाए, मार्केट मैकेनिज्म का अंदर आ जाए, तो जो छोटे फार्मर अपना जिंदगी के लिए लड़ते रहते हैं वो कहाँ रहेगा, उसका जमीन उसके पास रहेगा कि नहीं रहेगा, अपार्ट फ्रॉम ऑल अदर बिग प्रोजेक्ट, वो एक बड़ा इशू है. और इसके साथ साथ बहुत सारे इशू जुड़ा हुआ है. लेकिन मैं एक रिक्वेस्ट ये भी रख के ख़त्म करूँगा, ये जो एफर्ट है हमारा देशों का, जो स्मॉल होल्डर फार्मिंग का वॉइसेस को लार्जर फेरा में, राजदार फोरा में उठाने का और उसको एस्टेब्लिश करने का, क्योंकि जो ऐसे मैंने बोला, डोमिनेंट वॉइस ऑफ सिविल सोसाइटी ऑल्सो इन द इंटरनेशनल डिस्कशन इज दिस शुड नॉट फॉर्म एट ऑल ए पार्ट. तो इसको कैसे कलेक्टिवली और स्ट्रेंथन किया जाए, और कोई सजेशन है कैसे इसको हमारा गवर्नमेंट का तक पहुंचाया जाए, तो दैट शुड बी पार्ट ऑफ द consideration of this larger election.
Niche last. When we yeah. When do we come back?
So it is now already I don't know 1:30 is by which watch, but roughly by this clock it is 1:42. So can we come back in around 40 minutes and start the session? So 40 to 40 minutes. Thank you thank all of you for the participation in the first session. Hopefully we will continue in more detailed fashion. But in the second session we will start by listening to the actual climate impacts from different states. People who have either worked or either in the farming community or worked with those impacts.